Indeed, we do.
Better say something useful.
Thank you. So I'll just do a shorter version of welcome to the April conversation for AWR, the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. And we are indeed recording this session for future reference. The videos of our conversations are all available on our website, and we're building quite a repository of wonderful conversations with people working in our sphere. So thank you, Natalie, for joining us. And I'd just like to introduce Natalie for anyone who has the misfortune of not actually knowing much about Natalie or FRRR. Natalie is passionate about rural and regional Australia. When we met somewhere in the last 24 hours to discuss this conversation, that was really brought home to me as well. Passionate about the issues facing rural and regional communities. Natalie was appointed CEO of FRRR in November 2015 after joining FRRR in 2012. FRRR is the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, and I'm very conscious that every time I refer to FRRR, I'm a bit of a fan, I have to speak slowly to get the 3 R's in order. Anyway. So Natalie is responsible for shaping the strategy for FRRR, designing new programs and developing and nurturing new funding partnerships. In her previous roles with FRRR before becoming CEO, she was also responsible for managing natural disaster recovery and preparedness programs and those addressing social innovation. This could inspire questions. Before joining FRRR, Natalie consulted with Matrix on Board, working with a number of not-for-profit organisations in program evaluation, undertaking research analysis and developing business plans. She's worked with clients developing financial policies and procedures, strategic plans, organisational reviews, service mapping, feasibility studies and governance models. Natalie also held in-house roles at Evolve, Typo Station and at ANZ Banking Group. And she's implemented projects which makes tangible differences to the lives of people living in rural, regional and remote Australia. And Natalie is sitting in a gorgeous mud brick house in the small rural town of Maldon in central Victoria. So without much ado, Natalie, do you want to give us what your version of the Who is Natalie is rather than the official version? Can you just tell us about yourself, introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. And hello to you all, and it's really lovely to be here. I too would just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you from, which is the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and just pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging as well. So it's always odd when you hear your own bio kind of read out like that. You go, oh, they sound a bit, you know, they've done some stuff, which is sort of fun. But when I kind of think about who I am and my role and my background, I'm definitely a not-for-profit nerd. I think, you know, the potential and power of organisations that exist to serve the public good over private good is something we should cherish, invest in and make stronger. And that intersection with the fact that rural communities are driven by largely voluntary effort and, you know, that those community groups and not-for-profit organisations really are the things that hold the fabric together in rural Australia kind of collide for me in my work life and my personal life. So I guess the fall into philanthropy, you know, not many people actually set out to have a career in philanthropy or work in a philanthropic foundation. Most people end up there by some sort of chance of various meetings. But philanthropy also brings together those various passions and interests of mine in a really beautiful way, and enables me to kind of walk alongside and play an enabling role. I know myself well enough to know that I'm not the best frontline doer, but I'm a pretty good enabler and pretty good string puller and that kind of thing. So that's kind of what drives me and what I love about my role at FRRR. So for those of you that might not know what the FRRR or FRRR stands for, I often say we're not pirates and we're not a radio station because we get that a lot. and we have talked at the board level many times about, should we just change this name, because it's really problematic, but nonetheless it's been there for 20 years and we're sticking with it. So FRRR kind of had an interesting origin in the late 90s, where the philanthropic sector, which is a reasonably small sector in terms of particularly the amount of money, if you discount some of the bigger players that have come on in the last while, were really wanting to be able to support rural Australia, but were inhibited by doing that, you know, for a range of reasons. And the philanthropic sector in Australia has got a lovely way of kind of recognising a gap that is inhibiting their ability to give and creating the vehicles that enable them. And FRRR was one of those. So the Sydney Myer Fund got together with the Australian government and a whole range of other philanthropists and had FRRR established. It's got a special listing in the Tax Act and was set up with a corpus of funds from the government and the Sydney Myer Fund, and then essentially works as a, I guess, a backbone of sorts to enable philanthropy to reach rural Australia. So we've got a national footprint. We focus on smaller rural and regional or rural and remote areas, as well as regional areas. And our primary work is providing grants to community groups, but alongside that we do a heap of work in just kind of almost incidental capacity building, but also quite planned and deliberate capacity building, along with providing sort of policy insights and kind of informing good giving across regional Australia. So all of that kind of intersects with all the things that drive me. We've got a headquartered in Bendigo, got a team of about 28 at the moment, so we've grown a fair bit in the last few years. We distribute about $15 million a year to about 800 projects across the country, and about 40 to 50% of that tends to be in a disaster preparedness and recovery context, although I reckon that's obviously going to go up in the next couple of years, given the fires and the floods and drought and all of that.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm curious, when FRRR was first created, was that split between sort of general grant giving to support rural and regional communities and disasters? Was that the case, or did disaster grants emerge over time?
The disaster philanthropy side emerged, although FRRR was established during the drought, the last major drought. And so drought was very much the lens, and it was very much about renewal and long-term kind of support being available for communities as they experienced, you know, various shocks and stresses. And so at that time, you know, drought was kind of the lens, and Cyclone Larry was probably the next, you know, I think that was 2006, and that's when FRRR started to do some sort of, you know, not very well thought through funding, but, you know, deliberately allocated money towards disaster recovery. And then of course 2009 was when we really found that there was a useful role to play.
Yeah, so I'm interested to explore that and find out a bit more about when, where and how your involvement and your interest in all this emergency disaster relief happened, knowing that you've already told me the answer to this question, and I found that fascinating. So would you like to share your story of your connection to this?
Yes, so it predates my time with FRRR, when I was still living in Melbourne and working in consultancy, supporting not-for-profit organisations. So my husband and I got married on Black Saturday, a few kilometres away from where the Kilmore fires started, and just happened to be in a different wind direction that we were completely unaware until pretty late in the piece what was happening. And of course, lots of our family were from sort of around St Andrews, Kinglake, etc., and Beechworth. And so we were all quite happily camping and not quite understanding what was happening until I noticed that, you know, a few people weren't there anymore and asked where they'd gone. And then we kind of got a bit of a sense of what had happened. And in the morning, obviously, woke up to the devastation of what it was. We lived in Hurstbridge at the time and made the call to sort of, we realised that our dogs and we had all the wedding presents and thought, well, the house goes, we've kind of got basically what we need. So we took off on our honeymoon to the mid-north coast, which we were then flooded in for 2 weeks when we got there. So the irony was, you know, pretty amazing. And as we speak, obviously, the mid-north coast is devastatingly flooded now. It was that same region. So, you know, that was my kind of lived experience, and then of course going home and sort of settling back in and being a part, you know, around the recovery, and just really being witness to the immense community effort and you know, the heart and soul that was there, but also obviously the sadness and trauma. So we were there for a few years, and my family still, I've got family up that way as well still. But that kind of sparked off something in me that I'd never been exposed to natural disasters. I'd never been exposed really. I mean, I'd been a consultant and I'd been a marketing person, etc., but I hadn't really been in the fabric of community as they were experiencing something. And I was seeing the generosity pour in as well, which was, you know, at the time challenging because there was just, you know, stuff being thrown at the communities and a bit of overload, but at the same time the spirit and the generosity was amazing to witness and kind of sparked something in me.
Yeah. It's really interesting. When 2009 happened, when Black Saturday happened, I was living in Canberra and I'd defended my home through the Canberra fires. So it's not like and I had experienced fire as a teenager, but so it wasn't like I'd never experienced it before, but there was something different about the Black Saturday fires. Quite, I think that began the change in my life too. Quite a challenging, horrendous event for everyone. So, you know, I didn't know until you told me that you got married that day, so it must be quite pivotal, really, that sort of...
Yeah. And when the job with FRRR came up, so the second part of that is when we moved to Central Victoria after our first baby and kind of settled in and had a second baby. And then I was thinking, I don't really want to go back to consulting and I don't know what I'm going to do, but I might go try and find something locally. And just by chance had been on the train with somebody who, when we were pregnant and got chatting and saw each other down the track when we both had our babies, and I think we were at a garage sale. I said, oh, you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about work? And Sophie had been working in philanthropy for years and she understood all of that. And I, of course, have been doing what I'd been doing. And we saw the job at FRRR. It's a full-time program management role, developing and delivering the long-term recovery funding from Black Saturday through VBAF. Along with the 2011 flood funding, which was kind of happening then as well. And so we decided to throw our hats in the ring as a job share because neither of us could work full time, but we both sort of thought we would bring a really complementary skill set to that role. And, you know, we got it and we were quite a great duo in that role. And I learned heaps from her and, you know, we did some great stuff and pretty quickly realised the role was kind of, it needed, you know, one person and in fact, the job was big enough for two people to take parts of and do discreetly. So I kind of held on to the disaster recovery stuff and so looked after some other stuff. So that gave me also, you know, an incredible introduction and, you know, I've met some of the most wonderful people in my whole life through that work. So that was, 2012 where I kicked that off and started with a blank page with that parcel of funding, aside from the intention about psychosocial recovery and the long term, and we're still spending down those funds now, so that'll come to a conclusion in the next year or so. But you know, an amazing opportunity to work alongside people in community who are both working in recovery but also experiencing their own recovery, to design that in a way that would be the most meaningful.
Some of our younger members that are part of our mentoring program in the network have asked questions like, how do you get your career underway and what plans should you make and what steps should you take? And sometimes it's serendipitous, isn't it? So I find that fascinating that that's the story of how you got into FRRR. So let's explore, because I'm really interested, based on your experience, and I'm sure the other members are, based on your experience and your role and what you've seen unfold in your time with FRRR, can you share your view of what the key characteristics are of resilience and what disaster resilience means to you, and anything you want to tell us really about how you see it playing out and what we need to do perhaps more of?
It's a really interesting one, and I mean, even since we just had a brief chat about it yesterday, you know, I keep sort of contemplating this question. I think it's, you know, the golden question, but one thing that I think I keep coming to the conclusion of is that disasters happen on top of everything else. We know that. They're also something that are, becoming more frequent, and they're actually, in whatever form, kind of a constant fact of our world, whether that's a pandemic, whether it's a fire, a flood, a drought. These are our cycles. Climate change is real. And until we get on top of that, we're kind of dealing with this. And so for me, the question is less about, this might not make entire sense, but it's less about what disaster resilience means, but more about what our general whole resilience is. Because these kinds of events and experiences, they're all intersecting and interconnected. And they are playing out across what are increasingly dynamic and complex social, environmental, economic systems. And, if we keep responding to them on an incremental basis, and if we keep talking about disaster resilience as though it's a start and stop kind of concept, which is what, is the sort of temptation in this field, because it is hard and it's messy and it's complex. So I guess what I think about this is sort of probably not going to come as any great surprise, and could be quite logical, but it's about people and investing in leadership, but also kind of thinking about leadership in a far more nuanced way in terms of how you transition different types of leadership, how you bring on emergent leadership, how you ensure there's a diverse leadership base, how you ensure inclusion and that you get fresh thinking at the right times, and that you've got different types of leadership that can step in at different times and in different ways. And, that's actually a hard thing to cultivate in a community, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes some special, some special ingredients and a fair bit of resourcing, and time is the thing primarily. But that, in the communities that we support, where that is fostered and where it is really nurtured, you see it pay dividends when difficult times come, because they can actually mobilise and activate. So that's a bit of a no-brainer, but it's actually really hard. And I think it's spoken about a lot, but when it's, it's difficult to do, and it's woefully under-resourced generally. I think the other thing is to work on things that don't necessarily look and sound like recovery or preparedness. And so we've been delivering a sort of community-led disaster preparedness program. And Margaret, you've had a bit of engagement with this a few years ago. And we started off going into a couple of communities and saying, so, we're here to help you sort of think about your disaster preparedness. And what we found is that was a really unhelpful approach. And in fact, what we needed to do was just talk about them and where they were at as a community, and what do you need from us, and what are the things that are important, what are your priorities? And they were rarely about an overt disaster resilience initiative. I mean, there was one that was a flood map, but the rest of them were, cultural tours and all sorts of things that on the face of it had nothing to do with disaster resilience, but in fact were fundamentally the things that would make them stronger next time something happens. So I think that there's a bit of a tendency to think that if we're working in disaster preparedness, it has to be, we need a plan with a bunch of priorities that are going to mean that everybody's got their tick box or whatever. And that's helpful, obviously, and we need people to be informed and ready and all of that. But when we're talking about resilience, that's kind of what you've got to work on, and it has to come from that very organic place as well. So, that shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was. And, it just, as you would all know, if you start from the position of being a person in a community who is thinking about what's going to kind of come their way, you don't compartmentalise it, do you? You kind of think about it in a fairly whole way. So that's the way we should all approach it as well. And certainly policy settings should too. And I think the final one that I think is really critical and needs to be done more, better, and learnt from, is about giving authority to sort of informal structures and processes, and giving or creating conditions that can enable organisations and people, and this is my sort of passion for, that not-for-profit space coming through, but, really creating conditions that enable those organisations and community sort of leadership base to be authorised players in the EM system. And I think, again, we talk about it a lot, but doing it is really hard. And we see it happen all the time, where it kind of just gets pushed off to the side a little bit and then brought back in, or, you know, inefficiencies can occur when we're responding or when we're trying to develop plans, and, you know, a plan will be put in place over the top of a plan that was actually already being developed and that the community kind of had ownership of, and we all know all of that. So again, it's not easy, but when it's done, it makes an enormous difference, and you actually see both the recovery play out differently, but also the response phase play out differently as well. People behave differently when they're authorised and when they're enabled, when we know that. So, you know, again, easier said than done, but it's the beauty of the work that I do, that we can kind of put money into things that help to foster that. And we're a little bit unshackled in that way, that we can, you know, get in and support some of those interesting approaches, and hopefully they start to rise to the surface.
Which is one of the things I love about the sorts of programs you do support, and the freedom that you, the greater freedom anyway, that you have in what you can fund. It's really interesting because I often reflect on the things we know to be true, and we speak them all the time, and then asking ourselves, do we really act in that way? Do I really act in my work? I think all of us should ask this question. Do I really demonstrate being led by the community and starting where the community is at and using the community's existing networks and groups? Or do I actually walk in and add a layer that is unnecessary with the best of intent? So
yeah, and we're certainly guilty of it too. It's a constant, you know, awareness and yeah, those questions, those starting questions are always critical. Getting better at it.
That's right. We do need to, and if we all just keep that in our awareness, we will get better at it. But I love those early learnings from the program you referred to earlier about us thinking we could walk in and encourage a community to really look at its disaster preparedness, when actually what they need to do is build something else for some other part of community life. And if we just support them to do that, they will create the network. They will, anyway. It's all very interesting. We don't have to go at things directly. We can go at them slightly to the right or left and still get the outcome. I'm interested in any reflections you have about women and the role of women in the programs that you've supported and the communities you've become familiar with. Any reflections on the role of women in the work that we all do? We are essentially a women's network. I think we have a couple of male members, but right. We are essentially a women's network.
Yeah. Yes, it's something we talk about a bit, and I know, Amanda, you were kind of curious about it from the philanthropy perspective as well. I mean, from our perspective, what I would say is that behind, I reckon, the majority of grants that we make are women. And it's sort of interesting, and I often wonder why. You know, do we have a bias? Is it a particular type of project? Is it a particular type of organisation? You know, or is it a condition or a particular story about, particularly in rural communities, because that's our focus, obviously. And so, I mean, I think it's not because women are not busy and have time. In fact, they're often the busiest. And there is a saying, what is it, you know, if you want something done, ask the busiest person, and that tends to sort of fly.
My mother used to say, ask the busiest woman, but anyway.
Ask the busiest woman, there you go. So there's truth in it. I mean, we haven't really kind of dug into the data, you know, so what I'm saying is quite anecdotal. But my strong hunch is that if we were to dig into the data, we would kind of find that there's a very, very strong majority of women playing quite pivotal roles within their communities in a very quiet way. So what I kind of think is because they're connectors, you know, women are natural connectors. They'll be involved usually because of the role that they hold in either their family system or their community system. If they're parents, you know, they'll probably be connected with the school system, with the health system, with the, you know, whatever. They're kind of going to lots of places in a community that sort of would be different, I think, to the majority of men. Again, it's a generalisation anecdote. So in fact, just inherently the role that they hold is different. And so therefore their and they do tend to be connectors, and they tend to sort of enable, you know, different things to happen. And, you know, even if it's the driving everyone around to get to sport, or it's the, you know, whatever it is, the food tree if someone's just had a baby, or, you know, that's just my own sort of local experience. Those things, you know, they're doers, they make things happen, and they do it in a way that's really efficient. And so I think when we think about both rural communities and the way you just need to work to get things done, that's highly effective. You know, women, they're the powerhouse, they just get stuff done. And those rural women's networks, like, they're one of my favourite crew to ever go and, you know, go to one of their events. You just, yeah, they're just a powerhouse of action. I can see Kate nodding from Queensland. But the other thing, I think, in the disaster recovery context is a sort of interesting one. And I think it is also kind of a similar theme in terms of that connection and being able to have different conversations with different people in different ways and influence in different ways. You know, I think women can often get people to turn up to things in a different way. So, you know, again, they're vast generalisations, but I think it's our observation and tends to be what happens. And the quietness, you know, generally it's not loud and we must do this. It's just a, hey, let's make this thing happen. Who do we need to talk to? But the sort of flip side and slightly frustrating side of that is the potential under recognition and under acknowledgement of the role. And that's to my point earlier about the informal and needing to authorise that sort of informality more, because it is so powerful and it is where things sort of get traction, in my view.
Do you know, that's so interesting. So a completely unscripted question. It occurs to me to want to explore this a bit further. Anne has posted a question in the chat, wondering if you would expand on different sorts of leadership, and just hearing you talk about the role that women tend to play in communities. And I grew up in a rural community, and those of us who work with communities, a lot of women came to mind, a lot of neighbourhood house coordinators and lots of women who organise the food and the long-term children's activities and all sorts of things. And I'm thinking, so there's an informal kind of leadership, and I do wonder if you want to do some more reflecting on the different forms of leadership. There's no doubt in my mind that there are times during any disaster or emergency cycle where we do need strong, capable, loud, directive leadership, probably less often than the other kind. So I wonder what other reflections you might have on leadership and gender, so that we address Anne's question, but also just follow your reflections on the roles that women take.
Yeah, I guess there is that sort of perception sometimes that leadership is the out front directive style, and we all know that's not the case, but it's kind of what the general expectation in the public can be. So I always think about leadership as, in fact, only occurring with followership. You can't lead if you don't have people following you. And so, in fact, the followership is where the attention should almost go. That's my kind of way that I like to reverse engineer it in my brain.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it in that way, you think about, well, what does that followership need from leadership? You know, it does need direction sometimes. Sometimes it needs its voice to be heard. Often, in fact, it needs its own voice to be, the followership voice to be heard. You know, it needs to have autonomy and to have diversity to inform where to go. You know, if we think about leadership as being something to take us somewhere, you know, you need to be able to have that listening ability to the different voices and the different ideas, and you need risk-taking leaders, you need safety-keeping leaders, you need leaders who can shepherd when things are, you know, going a bit pear-shaped. You need leaders who can sit and be patient and stop and allow everybody to take a breath. And they're all different leaders, and sometimes they won't be in leadership roles. In fact, a lot of the time they're not in leadership roles, or what would be formally recognised as a leadership role.
Yeah.
And what we hear often, actually, well, all the people, I'm a bit like you, Margaret, I've got all these people sort of floating in my mind, and often you talk to them about being leaders and they go, oh no, I'm not a leader. I'm just helping get things. I'm just doing this at the moment. And it's actually, humility. And I think we did talk about humility when we caught up. And, if leadership starts with humility and a serving mindset to the followership, I think that's where you kind of get a true diversity of leadership.
Yeah.
I know that's my sort of philosophical musings, but Anne, I don't know if you've got other thoughts. I'm happy to love to hear those views.
And did you, because that was your question, did you want to ask any follow-up or make any comment whether we hit the...
Yes, so that was really coming out of another group that was talking about leadership, a women's group that was talking about leadership a week or two ago that I was in. And the women seem to sort of have the idea that you had to be in a designated leadership position to be a leader. So that authority of position, you're the mayor or you're the head of Rotary or whatever it is, gives you the authority to lead. And they didn't seem to, well, I do wonder whether the community standard concept of leadership is the sort of gendered, the man in front at the top, in a position of, a paid position of power. And so when I say something like mothers are leaders, it doesn't really, it seems to be the wrong concept, doesn't it?
So authority to make decisions is very different to being a leader, I reckon.
Yes.
And
but I think it gets confused.
It does, yeah. And sometimes you are both. You can be a mayor and an incredible leader and all of that, but fundamentally you're authorised to make decisions. That's my kind of simplistic way of framing it, but there is a distinction when you are in a role where you are expected to make decisions in the interests of a group of people or a region or whatever it might be, which is your commissioner, your mayor, your CEO, your whoever, versus a person who people around them trust to lead them and guide them through something challenging. And that's very different. It might be the mayor, but it might also be the mums, it might also be the neighbourhood house coordinator, whoever. Interesting.
So I'm interested to also explore so to sort of turn to a different topic for a minute. Feel free, everyone who's joined us, to throw questions into the chat, and we can definitely have less of a binary conversation, more of a complex conversation. But I'm interested, Natalie, in exploring, partly because even as recently as this week, I was talking with some people affected by the monsoon flood event in Townsville and doing some work with them. And they were talking about the fact that a lot of the people who fill roles in recovery are really exhausted at this point. So 18 months later, really starting to fall down. A couple of people have moved on to different work because they're just exhausted. And I thought it would be useful to explore with you how you sustain yourself, because your role is obviously a busy one. So I'm interested to know what you draw upon in your own life or in your own past or present or future. How do you face the exhaustion or the challenges? What do you do? Because we all have to do something to sustain ourselves.
Well, I just had my first holiday in 5 years, so that helped.
Right. Possibly overdue.
It was very overdue because there wasn't one last year, as was the case for most people. Look, in all seriousness, the work I do is interesting in that I'm kind of on the periphery, like I'm not in it. We've got a bit of an interesting role in that it's quite vicarious. So we're kind of, and we talk to our staff a bit about vicarious trauma, because being on the phone to people seeking money who are trauma affected can turn into conversations that are quite complex and, you know, we're not positioned to do. And just courtesy of, I guess, the scale that we work at and sort of both the macro perspective, but also the very close to the ground, you know, working with individual communities and organisations perspective, means we're kind of always trying to manage that balance between being in and out. And because of the successive and cumulative nature of our world, you know, we've been supporting drought affected areas, we've supported 2009 affected areas, you know, Cyclone Yazi, then we've, you know, gone, you know, some of those Queensland areas in particular that have gone, you know, 7-8 years without rainfall, only to then be affected by massive floods and have themselves wiped out. You know, just the cumulative pressure does feel overwhelming. And just when you think you're about to take a breath, something else happens, like last week and this week with the floods, just when we all felt like, okay, you know, we're going to get through this COVID thing and we'll be able to just sort of start building back a bit. And so it's, you know, it's difficult not to sort of feel exasperated and not feel overwhelmed and a little helpless some days. And you think, is all this for nothing? Like, what are we sort of, it's the David and Goliath. You just feel like you're up against an enormous thing and you're just trying to do the good work. But so having said that, you know, in those moments of depletion and in those moments of, heck, you know, like, are we actually ever making a difference? How do we do this? Yeah. Things like I go on the road and sit down with people in communities in the south coast of New South Wales last week, and you just kind of realise that there are thousands of incredible, very smart, committed people doing the same thing everywhere. And when you sort of get a bit of an insight into that, and you realise that, you know, there's people putting their shoulder to the wheel with a deep, firm optimism, you know, about if we do this and if we do it well and if we do it together, we will be able to tackle these challenges. And it's that kind of, you know, we think about we're dealing with global challenges, but starting local helps. You know, it's that sort of how do you eat an elephant? You start with a bit. And so that's kind of what keeps me going, is that it energises me. It reminds me that this is a collective that we're all working towards and part of, and we all have our little bit, and that if we're all kind of working, and it sounds a bit cliche, but if we're all kind of chipping away in different ways, then, you know, it's possible that we will be able to strengthen and respond and create a healthier future and environment. You know, and I guess the fundamental part of that is just thinking there's hope. There's hope. You're given hope, and if you get hope, you kind of get a bit of energy and you go, all right, we'll keep thinking about new ways, and you sort of get another gust of wind behind you. And that's kind of what happens. It's just a cycle of that.
That's right. There's so many lessons embedded in the work that we all do. I hadn't really appreciated, if I say 10 years ago, the importance and the value of hope and what hope can bring and what we can achieve if we have hope. I hadn't really appreciated the importance of hope. I'm also reminded of something you said earlier in today's conversation about the alignment between who Natalie is and the work of FRRR, and how much of a pleasure, I forget your exact words, it is to be able to have a role that aligns with who you are. Again, I'm drawn to some conversations with some of our younger members through the mentoring program of how do I decide what role to take on in this work. And I think in this society, we don't always encourage people to look within first and understand themselves and then choose something that matches that. Look, I'm aware there's a couple of questions here in the chat, and so I'm inclined to make sure I depart from my questions and go to some of these. So you won't be surprised by this question from Kate. I'd be interested to hear about some of the more innovative projects that some regional areas are doing. We're looking here in Townsville to bring community organisations together to build resilience, to supplement government and agency-led action. And that's really got two angles, hasn't it? She's keen to know about some innovative projects, but I love the fact that we are collectively trying to think of how to supplement government and large agencies by community action. So your reflections on that?
Yes, it's always really hard to pick one or two. So, you know, it's like that favourite child thing. So, and there are lots. And I guess the thing when I think about innovative is, you know, innovation happens in already existing things that are working well. And, you know, I see innovation as a how do you make something better or more effective, or how do you take advantage of a new kind of environmental opportunity that enables you to, you know, leverage something. And so, I mean, I guess some of the really clever things that we see happen are really in the, and it sounds a bit like what you're already working on, Kate, you know, about how you harness human capital and how you really leverage that. And so from a Queensland perspective, the Red Earth Community Foundation in the South Burnett, they also cover the North Burnett, have done some really interesting work because they actually got going after the floods and were the sort of the vehicle for the mayoral flood appeal fund distribution. But what they did, they set themselves up as a community foundation, which is essentially a philanthropic vehicle to build capital and keep it within a community for, you know, long-term benefit. But they also developed a leadership program, a community leadership program. And by doing that, what they very smartly did was build a whole coalition across their region of people who started talking the same language, who started talking together about what the shared aspiration was and started influencing all over the place. And now they're starting to actually build back, you know, they're starting to come back together and say, well, we've got all these major things happening. How are we going to do it? And so, you know, they've become a really strong alliance for council, because that's, you know, council knows they've got this group of people who they might not always be on the same page, but they can make stuff happen. And it's also about generational capability and bringing new people up the ranks as well, because one of the things that obviously happens is, as you've said, Margaret, is depletion and people get exhausted. And so, you know, by building and building and building, that's been a really smart strategy. And they've, I mean, I do reference them quite a bit because they've just been so clever about it, and it's sustainable, and they've just got the right people around the table. But that's sort of a connection between the local economic development group, you know, the community foundation leadership program, different land care type groups and farmer groups, and, you know, kind of it's a really nice hybrid around the social, economic, environmental strategies, and but fundamentally about building the human capital underneath it.
That's lovely, because it brings a lot of things together and acknowledges the complex links between all those things. So I'm tempted, given that time, to keep racing through some of the questions coming in. So Deb's asked a not very political question at all. What do you think about the government efforts in relation to resilience and recovery? You do have a national lens, so let's put you on the spot and say, yep, lessons learned, lessons forgotten, lessons learned, lessons forgotten. What do you think about government's role? Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Deb. Yes, lessons learned, lessons forgotten, lessons relearned. And yes, does it? I mean, really, it just feels like it continually goes on that cycle. And I think the interesting, challenging thing is that as a federated nation, our federation model is a really curious thing to have to manage in dealing with disasters. So when you've got state accountability, yet you've got this federal level that also kind of comes in at different times. And now we've got this sort of new federal agency. You know, I think what we fundamentally grapple with is that clunkiness of our federation. And then you've got local government, which is the closest to the ground, but the least resourced. And so we kind of got this really upside down model. And so, you know, it's not surprising that we don't kind of embed stuff because of that. And of course, we've got the political cycle, which, you know, tends to roll around more frequently than our major catastrophic disasters have. And so you're working with a constant churn and a constant change. And so even if you've got the right kind of policy intention, and even if you've got the right principles, the implementation side is a fluid thing in our experience. And so, you know, we feel like we re-educate every time. And, you know, every person we work with is fantastic. And they're all great and everyone's on the right page, but you're just having to go around again and again. And no matter what's documented and no matter what's, you know, put into frameworks, etc., the sort of political machine does get going, and we know that. And it just kind of overrides all of that. And that's, I guess, why I was saying earlier about, you know, we need to authorise the informal systems and structures, because, you know, if that's authorised, you've got more of a chance of influencing earlier in the piece, you know, and I think it's a tricky one, but I agree that it does seem like we go around in circles. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the floods. You know, I think on the donation side, it doesn't seem to have been as knee-jerk, and that might be because of fatigue, and it might be because we learned something and it's fresh enough in people's memories. It's hard to say at this point in time, but certainly it doesn't seem to be creating quite the same flurry. And I was in touch with Gibbet and they said, you know, we're just getting a sense that places aren't being dumped with heaps of donations they don't need. So, well, okay, that's promising. Maybe it's because they can't get in there. I don't know. But we're hoping, you know, that felt like all right, hopefully that, you know, it hasn't been that long that everyone has completely forgotten and lost trace of, you know, all of those lessons. Yeah. So the question becomes, how do you keep it, you know, top of mind? And I think there's some promising things going on that you know, have got the right intention. You know, there's some discussion about a charities charter and what that might, you know, do in terms of having a public kind of statement around the way that we do this stuff from a charitable level, how we handle donations. So no, I remain optimistic. The new agency is, you know, there's some interesting sort of concepts there and a good design intent in terms of it being all hazards. Don't know if it's grappling with the fundamental challenges about the federated model, but that's, yeah, perhaps that's a different part of the elephant, I don't know.
Hmm. So it's interesting, Amanda asks a question which I'd like to sort of rephrase slightly because I want to add what we've just been talking about. So Amanda's question is, any tips for people who might want a grant from FRRR? Mm-hmm. So the inside gold would be good. But I'm also wondering whether to broaden that about any tips for people trying to work, community people in particular, trying to work within that situation you've just described with many layers, local government, state government, federal government. How can community people look to me and often say, and I'm sure they do to others, I don't even understand the system. I don't understand who I'm talking to. I just want it to be easier. And I want it to be led by my needs, not which agency is in front of me. So that whole coordination, collaboration. So any tips for people who want a grant, and any thoughts about how people can navigate this kind of support system that's clunky?
Well, the easy one first, FRRR. So Ring Us is probably the very simple one, and we can talk about what the project is, what the idea is, but we've also got heaps of resources on the website in terms of, you know, video clips of community groups talking about how they went about getting a grant, what they put together. So that's on our, I think it's on the insights area. And that's from, you know, local community groups who had never applied for a grant before and kind of managed to do that with FRRR a few times, and in their own words talked about how they went about that and the things that they got organised around. So they're really good. Obviously, we've got a newsletter monthly that puts out when dates are closing and all of that. But really, if it's sort of a matter of overwhelming, you know, can't even fathom looking, just get on the phone to us and our team are really happy to have a conversation. They're always around and very keen to hear what's happening, and they will direct people in the best place to go. our application, we've also got on our website a bit of a self-help process. So when you get to our website, there's if you're looking for funding, and then you can actually click on like your state, the type of thing you're wanting to do. So if it's community infrastructure, mental health, or whatever it might be, and it will deduce for you and tell you which grant programs you can apply to. So that's also a new thing that we're hoping is helpful. So that's all fairly straightforward. We've got lots of different grant programs all the time. So it's a bit of a moving feast, but there's usually, well, there's always at least one thing on the go, and one of our national programs on the go. So they're sort of there. Reasonably high competition. We generally have about a 50% success rate as our minimum. And we try to make it better than that, but that's the average, which is better than most, but it's still, we'd like it to be more. Getting there. That's all about the money we bring in.
And probably withdraw the question about how do people navigate the clunky support system at multiple levels of government. That's a bit of a complicated.
Yeah, I can't fix that, unfortunately. But I think
I'm beginning to think
that goes to what we were just talking about in Deb's question.
I'm beginning to think that communities need advocates who do some of that on their behalf, but that's probably another conversation. Look, I'm very conscious we're running out of time, and there are a couple of questions we haven't had a chance to address. I'd love to just, because of the nature of the work that you've described and the role of FRRR, I'd love to go to Mel Taylor's question and just say, any thoughts on how we do keep the momentum going on community-led approaches? Because with those short timeframes you referred to for projects and governments, and we know community-led recovery takes ages, any thoughts about how we keep momentum going? Any tips?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Mel. So one of the things that we notice is effective or helpful, and it's again that sort of elephant metaphor, is thinking about what the big picture is and taking incremental steps, and sort of knowing that along those incremental steps you might actually need different types of people to be doing some parts of the work. And so when we think about some of the community-led resilience type initiatives that we've supported, we might provide funding for a one-off project, but in fact we'll keep on funding them for, it might be 10 years, that we'll kind of get to know that community, and we'll know that they're building, they're just continually building, and we will kind of hear about the same people, but there'll be different organisations that we're funding, but we know they're part of, this whole kind of movement.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it might be the preschool, sometimes it might be the neighbourhood centre, sometimes it might be the Chamber of Commerce, sometimes it might be the art group, but they all talk about each other. And so the way we assess, and that's to one of the other questions, is, what do we consider? We look at it from a kind of whole place perspective, and we're interested in, okay, so who else are you working with? And, who's not at the table that, it would make sense to have at the table, and that kind of thing. And so that, I think, is something that can make it manageable, and not kind of thinking, gosh, we've got this enormous agenda and we need to get it all. It's kind of like, well, how do you make sequential steps so that they each build on each other over time? And it's just
I love that about FRRR having that long-term perspective. There may well be short-term projects, but if you're having that place-based long-term overview, then thank goodness for FRRR. Look, I'm Amanda, by all means catch up with Natalie. That's a great idea. So I'm very conscious of the time, and I don't like to run over because I know people have other things they need to go to. We didn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully we got to enough. Thank you so much for your time, Natalie. It's been a lovely, fascinating conversation to have. For anyone who joined late, I did actually acknowledge traditional owners. I just forgot to start recording, so I had to start again. Thank you, Amanda, for reminding me. And thank you all for coming along. And I think we'll call it a day. Thanks, Natalie, very much.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
Good
Margaret.
to see you all.
Bye. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.